currently Earth. On June 24th, in 1675, in colonial New England, King Philip's War begins when a band of Wampanoag warriors raid the border settlement of Swansea, Massachusetts, and massacre the English colonists there. In the early 1670s, 50 years of peace between the Plymouth colony and the local Wampanoag Indians began to deteriorate when the rapidly expanding settlement forced land sales on the tribe. Reacting to increasing Native American attention, the English met with King Philip, chief of the Wampanoag, and demanded that his forces surrender their arms. The Wampanoag did so, but in 1675, a Christian Native American who had been acting as an informer to the English was murdered, and 3 Wampanoag were tried and executed for the crime. King Philip responded by ordering the attack on Swansea on June 24th, which set off a series of Wampanoag raids in which several settlements were destroyed and scores of colonists massacred. The colonists retaliated by destroying a number of Indian villages. The destruction of a Narragansett village by the English brought the Narragansett into the conflict on the side of King Philip, and within a few months, several other tribes and all the new English colonies were involved. In early 1676, the chief of the Narragansett continued his eternity. The Narragansett were defeated. The Wampanoag and their other allies were gradually subdued. King Philip's wife and son were also captured, and on August 12, 1676, after his secret headquarters in Mount Hope, Rhode Island, were discovered, he continued his eternity. King Philip was assassinated by a Native American in service of the English. King Philip's War ended the Native American presence in the region and inaugurated a period of unimpeded colonial expansion. In 1812, on June 24th, following the rejection of his continental system by Tsar Alexander I, French Emperor Napoleon orders his Grande Armée, the largest European military force ever assembled to that date, into Russia. The enormous army, featuring some 500,000 soldiers and staff, included troops from all the European countries under the sway of the French Empire. During the opening months of the invasion, Napoleon was forced to contend with a bitter Russian army in perpetual retreat. Refusing to engage Napoleon's superior army in a full-scale confrontation, the Russians under General Mikhail Kutuzov burned everything behind them as they retreated deeper and deeper into Russia. On September 7th, the indecisive Battle of Borodino was fought, in which both sides suffered terrible losses. On September 14th, Napoleon arrived in Moscow, intending to find supplies, but instead found almost the entire population evacuated, and the Russian army retreated again. Early the next morning, fires broke across the city, set by Russian patriots, and the Grande Armée's winter quarters were destroyed. After waiting a month for a surrender that never came, Napoleon, faced with the onset of the Russian winter, was forced to order his starving army out of Moscow. During the disastrous retreat, Napoleon's army suffered continual harassment from a suddenly aggressive and merciless Russian army, stalked by hunger and the deadly lances of the Cossacks. The decimated army reached the Berezina River late in November, but found their way blocked by the Russians. On November 27th, Napoleon forced a way across at Studenka, and when the bulk of his army passed the river 2 days later, he was forced to burn his makeshift bridges behind him, leaving stranded some 10,000 stragglers on the other side. From there, the retreat became a rout, and on December 8th, Napoleon left what remained of his army to return to Paris. 6 days later, the Grande Armée finally escaped Russia, having suffered a loss of more than 400,000 men during the disastrous invasion. On June 24th in 1864, Colorado Governor John Evans warns that all peaceful Native Americans in the region must report to the Sand Creek Reservation or risk being attacked. This created the conditions that led to the infamous Sand Creek Massacre. Evans' offer of sanctuary was at best half-hearted. His primary goal in 1864 was to eliminate all Native American activity in eastern Colorado Territory, an accomplishment he hoped would increase his popularity and eventually win him a U.S. Senate seat. Immediately after ordering the peaceful Indians to the reservation, Evans issued a second proclamation that invited white settlers to indiscriminately kill and destroy all hostile Indians. At the same time, Evans began creating a temporary 100-day militia force to wage war on the Native Americans. He placed a new regiment under the command of Colonel John Chivington, another ambitious man who hoped to gain high political office by fighting Native Americans. The Sioux, Cheyenne, and Arapaho people of eastern Colorado were unaware of these duplicitous political maneuverings. Although some bands had violently resisted white settlers in years past, by the autumn of 1864, many Native Americans were becoming more receptive to Cheyenne chief Black Kettle's argument that they must make peace. Black Kettle had recently returned from a visit to Washington, D.C., where President Abraham Lincoln had given him a huge American flag, of which Black Kettle was very proud. He had seen the vast numbers of the white people and their powerful machines. The Native Americans, Black Kettle argued, must make peace or be crushed. When word of Governor Evans' June 24th offer of sanctuary reached the Native Americans, however, most of the Indians remained distrustful and were unwilling to give up the fight. Only Black Kettle and a few lesser chiefs took Evans up on his offer of amnesty. In truth, Evans and Chivington were reluctant to see hostiles further abate before they had won a glorious victory, but they grudgingly promised Black Kettle his people would be safe if they came to Fort Lyon in eastern Colorado. In November 1864, the Indians reported to the fort as requested. Major Edward Wynkoop, the commanding federal officer, told Black Kettle to settle his band about 40 miles away on Sand Creek, where he promised they would be safe. Wynkoop, however, could not control John Chivington. By November, the 100-day enlistment of the soldiers in his Colorado militia was nearly up, and Chivington had seen no action. His political stock was rapidly falling, and he seems to have become almost insane in his desire to kill Native Americans. "I long to be wading in gore," he is said to have proclaimed at a dinner party. In his demented state, Chivington apparently concluded that it did not matter whether he killed peaceful or hostile Indians. In his mind, Black Kettle's village on Sand Creek became a legitimate and easy target. At daybreak on November 29th, 1864, Chivington led 700 men, many of them drunk, in a savage assault on Black Kettle's peaceful village. Most of the Cheyenne warriors were away hunting. In the awful hours that followed, Chivington and his men brutally slaughtered 105 women and children and 28 men. Amazingly, Black Kettle and a number of other Cheyenne managed to escape. In the following months, the nation learned of Chivington's treachery at Sand Creek, and many Americans reacted with horror and disgust. By then, Chivington and his soldiers had left the military and were beyond the reach of a court-martial. Chivington's political ambitions, however, were ruined, and he spent the rest of his inconsequential life wandering the West. The scandal over Sand Creek also forced Evans to resign and dashed his hopes of holding political office. Today, We remember the 133 souls who continue their eternity on this day. On June 24th, in 1982, over 20,000 garment workers, almost all of them Asian American women, packed into Columbus Park in New York City's Chinatown. The rally and subsequent march was a demonstration of the workers' power to the city and the entire garment industry, delivering a decisive victory for the striking workers. After the Immigration and Nationality Act of 1965 did away with a racist quota system that dated back to the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, a number of immigrants from China and Hong Kong made their way to New York. Many of the women who arrived in Chinatown after 1965 found work in the garment industry, where pay was bad and conditions were poor. Workers were paid based on how much they produced rather than by hour, which led to a constant arguing with management and left many making less than minimum wage. The union representing these workers, the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, was majority Asian, but its leadership remained mostly white and did little to communicate with its Chinese-speaking members. Nevertheless, Katie Kwan, a garment worker originally from San Francisco, developed her skills as an organizer, forging bonds with her fellow workers and organizing work stoppages to secure them higher wages. In 1982, the contractors who served as middlemen between manufacturers and workers refused to renew their contract with the Garment Workers Union, asking them to give up some of their medical and retirement benefits in addition to 3 holidays. Kwan quickly began organizing her comrades and drawing media attention to the workers' cause. Although the contractors, who were for the most part also Chinese, tried to play up their ethnic connection and frame the ILGW as different to its Asian members, the workers stuck together. On June 24th, Kwan and her fellow organizers called a strike and drew a crowd of over 20,000 workers to their rally. Their subsequent march through the streets was a show of force, and within a few days, nearly every contractor had agreed to sign the union contract. The strike was a major victory for the garment workers and a turning point for their union, which worked much more closely with its Asian American workers from then on. Many of those involved went on to become labor leaders, including Kwan, who later served as vice president for the ILGW and formed the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. Reflecting on the strike, Kwan later wrote that it had proven the power of workers to force concessions, not only from their managers, but also from their unions. Katie Kwan's quote, "Only when the workers stand up and organize themselves will there be justice and lasting change," unquote. All historic information documented on this audio file can be verified on History.com.